Good evening now, and welcome to our time on the reliability of the Old Testament. Hopefully you can all see my screen, and I want to share with you some thoughts about the trustworthiness of the Old Testament. I wrote a little book, a tiny book on the reliability of the Gospels. I'd like to write a really big book on the reliability of the Old Testament, but it's going to take quite a while. So in the meantime, we're going to have a look at this page. And this page is an old page, as you can see. It's about 400 years old. It's a page of the King James Version of the Bible. And it's 2 Kings chapter 18. Why would I start a talk on the reliability of the Old Testament with this? Well, we can zoom in, and we'll zoom in even further. A key thing about the King James Bible is that it's old and precedes archaeology. And I just want to dive into a passage from 2 Kings chapter 18, verse 13. Slightly strange English, but I'll read it out loud. So we're in the top line. Now, in the 14th year, and I'll say it's slightly strange, of King Hezekiah, did Sennacherib, king of Assyria, so that thing is an S for Assyria, come up against all the fenced cities of Judah and took them. And Hezekiah, king of Judah, sent to the king of Assyria, to Lachish, saying, I have offended, return from me. That which thou puttest on me will I bear, which actually means whatever you fine me, I will pay. And the king of Assyria appointed unto Hezekiah, king of Judah, 300 talents of silver and 30 talents of gold. That doesn't mean he gave them. He said, this is what you've got to pay, dude. And Hezekiah gave him all the full silver that was found in the house of the Lord and in the treasures of the king's house. A little bit later on, we see this. And the king of Assyria sent Tartan and Rabsaris and Rabshakeh from Lachish to King Hezekiah with a great host, a great army against Jerusalem. And they went up and came to Jerusalem. And when they were come up, they came and stood by the conduit of the upper pool, which is in the highway of the fuller's field. I love this old stuff because no apostrophes, only 24 letters in the alphabet, I's and J's are the same, U's and V's are the same. It's really great. So when you're thinking about the KJV, just remember there was no separate J or V back at that time. But what's really interesting for this is that we've got a 400-year-old Bible. And in that 400-year-old Bible, we find a number of claims made about history. Namely, there was a Judean king called Hezekiah, that all the fortified, it used the word fence, but that meant fortified, walled cities of Judah were captured, all except for Jerusalem. This was done by a man called Sennacherib, who was king of Assyria. Sennacherib is particularly connected in that context with Lachish. And Hezekiah was fined 30 talents of gold and 300 talents of silver. And in response, Hezekiah gave all of the silver that was in the king's house and in God's house, the temple. Now, was that just coincidentally the same amount as he'd been fined, or was it a different amount? Well, we'll think about that later. Now, the significance of that is really when we think about someone like Napoleon Bonaparte, that Brits don't like to think about too much because we fought him. But we could also think about Thomas Jefferson, because Jefferson over in the US and Napoleon Bonaparte in the Middle East really began the science of archaeology. Bonaparte took experts with him in his campaign into Egypt in 1799. So Jefferson did a bit of digging slightly before that. But in terms of Middle East archaeology, it began with Napoleon Bonaparte 220 years ago or so. After that, then Egyptian gets deciphered, then Assyrian and so on. All of which means that if I get a Bible that is 250 years old or 400 years old, and people could get those, sometimes family Bibles and so on, that old, I know that there has been no input from archaeological knowledge into that Bible whatsoever. The only way there's anything in that Bible is because over time people have handed down written copies. That's the only way you can have information. No one's been able to cheat and look at archaeology, all of which means it's really interesting when you ask yourself the question, well, of all of the things mentioned in the Bible, how many of them have then been confirmed by archaeology in the last 220 years since archaeology began? Well, think of it like this. The Bible mentions 5 Assyrian kings. It mentions Tiglath-Pileser. And guess what? Archaeology finds him. it mentions Shalmaneser. Guess what archaeology finds him? Sargon, Sennacherib, Esarhaddon. It mentions the 5 in a particular order. Well, in the book of Isaiah, or Isaiah, you might say, not quite sure, because it's not part of the main Old Testament narrative. But the other 4 are in a particular order, and archaeology finds them in that order. If you'd gone to someone, a Christian, a Bible reader from 400 years ago and said, can you name me the Assyrian kings? They would have looked in their Bible if they didn't have it in their head, and they would have said, yes, and this is the order they came in. And guess what? Archaeology comes up, and it actually finds them in that order. And there are more things that actually get found. This is our great repository in London, the British Museum, where we put all our stolen artifacts. And we got loads of things in there. And you've even got Assyrian kings wallpaper. This is a place where Assyrian king, actually, Sennacherib, records the siege of Lachish, which is mentioned in the Bible. And you've got that confirmation of it. There are 3 copies, one in the British Museum and 2 in other museums, of Sennacherib's own account of how he went and attacked Jerusalem. And this is what he says. This is Sennacherib, the Assyrian king's own record of what he did. As for Hezekiah the Judean, I besieged 46 of his fortified walled cities. Now notice that's the same phrase that we get in the Bible. They're walled or fenced or fortified. I conquered them and took out 200,150 people. He himself, and this is called political spin, when he doesn't actually manage to capture a city, how can he put that positively? He says this: he himself I locked up within Jerusalem, his royal city, like a bird in a cage. Well, of course, he didn't get into the cage. Hezekiah was overwhelmed by the splendor of my lordliness, and he sent me 30 talents of gold, 800 talents of silver. That's interesting, because what was it in the Bible? It was 30 talents of gold, 300 talents of silver was the fine, but then Hezekiah responded by sending all of the silver that was in his house and all of the silver that was in the temple. Now, this is a totally phenomenal thing. I'm really, really interested by the fact that the Bible and the thing outside the Bible agree on the exact amount of gold. I think that's far more interesting than the difference on the amount of silver. And even in this verse that we looked at earlier, we can see some Assyrian names. Assyrian gets deciphered in the 1850s. We now have dictionaries of this language, and look, there's the one for Tartan. Tartanu, that who is just a case ending, and he means deputy or second in command. And Rab, you can see there on the right, a bit like rabbi, is a chief or overseer. In other words, we even have Assyrian technical words transferred in the Bible. Now, other things that you have in the Bible, and I'll bring this together and explain the significance, are, for instance, that the Bible mentions that Hezekiah built a conduit and a pool and brought water into the city. And guess what? People have discovered this tunnel. In fact, with my family over New Year, and I took my daughter, who's here, and my son through this tunnel. And when we got to the end and we'd paddled through the water with our lights in the dark for a while, and it's over 500 meters long, my son liked it so much, he said, we must go back through. And when my son says we must do things, he can be very persuasive. We must go back through without lights. And so we actually ended up doing that, which was quite an experience. So I went through it twice in one day. But, you know, it's there. It's mentioned in the Bible. Archaeologists then discover it. If you get a Bible, this is a Bible, American Bible from 1785, you can see there on the right-hand side, it will name the date of a particular event in the margin. These dates came into margins of Bibles, you know, about the year 1700. And the amazing thing is they get the date of this event 1 year different from what we now think based on archaeology. And it's not a date that comes from exactly the Bible. It's a date using the Bible and other things to infer together. Well, what's so surprising is that the King James Bible is based on a printed Hebrew Bible for the Old Testament, made from 1525. And the people who made that had no manuscripts earlier than the year 1100. But the events we're talking about happened 700 BC. In other words, there's a gap of 1,800 years between the manuscripts of the Old Testament and the events. And that is an amazing thing, because that means that 1,800 years worth of scribes have copied things so that the Assyrian kings are mentioned in the right order, with their names spelt right, with the Assyrian names right, and even numbers getting transmitted well over time. Well, think about how easy it is to miscopy a number. If you miscopy one digit in a phone number, you can't get in contact with someone anymore. So this is a quite phenomenal thing. And what it does, it illustrates an argument that I want to call the argument from vindicated trust. Because, you know, when we think of reformers, Luther, Calvin and others, they had no access to archaeology. It hadn't begun at the time. And they trusted that the Bibles they had recorded real history. They would have been amazed at the thought that actually people in the year 1800 and afterwards would dig things out of the ground, then decipher those ancient languages, and then find the very things that they were reading about in the Bible being confirmed. This is extraordinary, and it shows how rational it can be to trust things even before the earliest copy, because their earliest copy was only 1100 AD, and yet it was giving reliable information from 1800 years prior. Now, when people look at the whole question of advanced information, I ask, what's the most advanced? Is it a clay-baked writing tablet? Is it a leather manuscript? Or is it your cell phone? And people say, well, a cell phone. Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, once it's the clay-baked tablet, quite heavy, seems quite primitive. The manuscript seems a bit more advanced because, you know, it's lighter and so on, easier to copy. And the cell phone seems the most advanced. It can send information around the world. It's great. You then ask the question, which lasts the longest? Well, I mean, how many people are using cell phones that they used even 5 years ago? Okay, yes, my wife is on this call, but I mean, generally, it doesn't happen very much. Certainly not 10 years ago. This is an extraordinary thing. But then you ask yourself the question, which contains the oldest text? The answer could well be your cell phone, because that phone can have a bit of ancient text in it on one of the apps. So in other words, you've got to be very careful that we don't discriminate against the Bible based on the things it's written on. You see, the Bible was written on leather and papyrus and perishable material. That's the sort of thing we know that Jews wrote on. We know it from the Dead Sea Scrolls, where papyrus and particularly leather have been found. We know it from seal impressions on the back of showing papyrus fibers. We know that. But the Mesopotamians, you know, between the Assyrians and so on, they wrote on clay tablets. And guess what? That means the Assyrian stuff survives. And so what happens is people go to museums and they say, oh, look, all that Assyrian stuff is so old. Oh, I'm not so sure the Bible's as old as that. I'm not sure the Bible is really real. Because they don't think that you ought to put a Bible actually within a museum. I know there's a museum of the Bible, that's great. But they don't actually think that the Bible is of the same age as the artifacts that you have from Mesopotamia. And in fact, texts can be handed down over a really long period of time. And we've got evidence the Old Testament texts were. You look at your kings in the Bible, they're on the left-hand column. And in fact, a whole load of them are mentioned by Assyrian kings. So it's not just that we have Assyrian kings mentioned in the Bible, we also have Bible kings mentioned in Assyrian records. They confirm each other. In fact, you look at kings of Judah, the ones in green are highlighted, they've been discovered. That's 26%. Israel's a bigger kingdom, and therefore more of them are mentioned international. That's about 39%. Now, sometimes people say, I'm not going to believe anything in the Bible unless it's confirmed by something outside the Bible. That's a bit like saying, I'm not going to trust a particular person until every single one of their words is confirmed by something else. That's saying you don't trust them. And it really would not be very fair to say, okay, I'm not going to trust any of the history of Nevada other than from records that come out from outside Nevada. You know, that wouldn't be fair if you say, I'm not going to accept any of the record of Britain except what's recorded outside Britain, or I'm not going to accept any Egyptian history except for what comes from things written outside Egypt. But people do that with the Old Testament. They say, I'm not going to accept Israelite history except for things that are written by non-Israelites outside the Bible. Well, look, the Old Testament is the Israelites' own history, so you shouldn't discount it. You can also look at the numbers of years that they reigned. I don't know how many of you know about the mathematical rule called Benfords Law of leading digits. It's a remarkable law that basically says when you look at natural things, whether you're looking at, redwoods or bristletone pines, or you're looking at the number of lakes that occur, or whether you measure them in feet or inches or meters, it really doesn't matter. The number one is going to occur most, number two, second most, third most, and so on. Look at ages. More people are 101 and 11 and 1 and 19, and they all have the number 1 in, plus people with 81. The number 8 is going to occur a lot less. There are 88-year-olds, of course, but just by frequency, the number 1's going to occur more. But you could measure age in days, in months, in years. It's not going to make any difference. In natural data sets, the number 1 occurs about 30% of the time. Now, this can be used to find out whether a set of data is real or is artificial. Because if people are just generating numbers artificially, they actually don't follow these proportions, if that makes sense. Like, this doesn't happen with your cell phone numbers, because they've got all sorts of numbers in, and they occur in roughly equal proportions. But if you're measuring the numbers of hairs on people's heads, or the number of crocodiles in a river, or anything where there's enough of it and you're measuring it, this is the sort of proportion that things happen in. You could then look at the ages of the kings of Judah, for instance, and the length of their reigns, and you can actually find that, yes, basically all of these digits are occurring in the sort of proportion we would expect. Another thing in the Bible we can say is that the chronology of the Bible is detailed when we would expect it to be. It's quite vague in the book of Judges because there's no central government keeping time. You then get to the time of Kings when there is a central government, and it gets very precise. Then you get to the time of the Persians when it's the Persians' job to keep time, not the Israelites' job to keep time. The patterns actually fit very well. Another reason to trust the Old Testament is when we look at the actual content. So here is a Phoenician king boasting. He says, I am Kilamua, the son of King, and then there's a name missing. King Gabar reigned over Yatdia, or Yadia, if you like, but achieved nothing. Then came Bama, and he achieved nothing. My own father, Haya, did nothing with his reign. My brother Shail also did nothing. It was I, Kilamua, who managed to do what none of my ancestors had. You might notice a little bit of a bias there, because he's wanting to claim that he's done everything and the rest have done nothing. Well, contrast that, for instance, with a fairly typical text in the Bible, where it will talk about Ahaziah, and how, he began to reign, son of Ahab began to reign over Israel in Samaria. He reigned 2 years over Israel. He did what was even in the sight of the Lord and walked in the ways of his father and the ways of his mother, etc., who made Israel to sin. Now, contrast that with all of the ancient Near Eastern things. Amenhotep from Egypt tells you Amenhotep was great. Ramses from Egypt tells you Ramses is great. Kilamua from the Phoenician king, he tells you Kilamua is great. That's what they do. One thing we can say about the books of Kings in the Old Testament, they're not written as royal propaganda. They just don't have that pattern at all. I want to tell you a bit about a project that we're doing at the moment at Tyndale House. So we're having great fun with a whole team of researchers of ancient names working. And we are actually producing the biggest database in the world of all of the names, not just of the Bible, but all of the surrounding cultures. And we're entering data often from primary sources, and we've got people working at a very high level on that. And it's very exciting because one of the things that you can say is that names change over time. This is an argument that can be made for the reliability of the Gospels, where the names are right for the time and place, but also it fits for the Old Testament. So here in Numbers chapter 1 are the leaders of the 12 tribes. And thank you, it doesn't just give you the leaders of the 12 tribes, it also gives you their fathers. So you've got 24 names in there. And you notice that a whole load of them have got El or Eli in, which is a name for God. None of them have Yah in at all, which is what you'll find, say, lots of names in the book of Jeremiah. but because the fashions change over time. This is right for the book of Numbers. And you contrast that, for instance, with one single verse or two verses from the book of Jeremiah there at the bottom, where you can see 5 names in a row and Yah, which is part of God's special name. So in other words, the names change over time. Now, if you were to make up a story hundreds and hundreds of years after the events, you probably wouldn't be able to give people the right sorts of names in the right proportions to each other. And what we're finding is the Bible's got those sort of things right. You look at the leaders of the 12 tribes, and some of them got the bit Shaddai in, meaning almighty. Some of them have got the word Zorin, meaning rock. And some of them have got the word Ammi in, meaning relative or people. And people actually observe how, wow, this isn't just something that's occurring in Israel. Those bits of names are really fashionable in other cultures at the time. Now, some people like the idea that the Old Testament was really written down hundreds and hundreds of years after the events. Well, if it was, how did they get the right sorts of names? This wouldn't be possible. We can actually divide the Old Testament into different stages of names. And this is a very rough outline. We're actually going to get far, far more detailed in our project. But there are names in Genesis, for instance, that begin with an I or a J that are a verb that begins with an I or a J. Jacob, Isaac, Ishmael, Joseph. Those sort of go a bit out of fashion, and we've seen some of the tendency we have in the book of Numbers, a different sort of pattern where you make up names generally out of 2 bits, Zuri, Shaddai, Zur and Shaddai together. That's a common way, and that's different from what you get then in the book of Jeremiah. These sort of patterns change over time, and also you can analyze them by tribe, you can analyze them by geographical location, you can analyze them by families, where we can actually say that families have particular naming patterns which really fit the time and place. So there's phenomenal numbers of converging arguments for the reliability of the Old Testament, not yet published, unfortunately, but we're on our path to do that. Did you know that the daughters of Zelophehad, remember Zelophehad's daughters come up in Numbers 27 and Numbers 36, 5 daughters, and famously one of them's called Noah, although Noah's spelled a bit differently from Noah in the Old Testament. Did you know that 3 of those daughters' names are confirmed archaeologically? They actually became tax districts, which is what you would expect if land was named after them. People, subsequent generations, that became the regional name. And there you got Mahlah, Noah, Hoglah, Milcah, and Tirzah, those names from Numbers 27. And it's amazing, actually. Here we have, and I'm afraid I have to show you a picture rather than the actual image of this piece of pottery, because the writing is so faint. In fact, the writing is in Istanbul archaeological museums, and people haven't been able to get access to these for quite a while. And I hope that if we could get multi-spectral imaging on this, we'd actually be able to read more of these texts, because they've been there, they've been known for about 100 years or more, and over half of them haven't yet been read because they're just too difficult to read. But here, I don't know if you can see my mouse, but just if you look at that top line and the left-hand 3 letters, there's something with a really long tail under it, the left-hand 3, and that's the N of Noah, and it's going left. But also Hoglah, who occurs on a couple of these different things as well. Oh, you can see one of the bits of pottery in a picture there, and you can see how difficult the writing is to read. Here's some verses from Joshua chapter 17, and there's a whole load of people there: Abiezer, Helek, Azriel, Shechem, and Shemidah. All of those come in this same horde of what's called the Samaria ostraca, each one confirmed as an area. So in other words, there's plenty of argument for the reliability of the Old Testament. Now, I just want to end by telling you a little bit about how you can take these things further. So at Tyndale House in Cambridge, we produce a free magazine, and you can sign up to receive that. That's at tyndalehouse.com, the URL there on the right, /magazine. And also we do have a 501c3, the American Friends of Tyndale House, through which people are able to give to support our work. But that magazine is aimed at people to get them more serious about the Bible. We write in a voice that doesn't presuppose that people are Christians, so you can give that to non-Christians, but it's saying that everyone in the world needs to get more serious about the Bible. There's a lot that we can learn about it historically, and it really is true and reliable. So I think that's what I had to share with you, and now we're going to have some time for questions. And